1. So, people of the interwebs, I bring you some of the short stories of the petty revenge war that exists since God knows how long. You see, my grandmother has 3 daughters, being my mother the oldest. Apparently, my mother and her younger sister have been on this petty revenge back and forth for so long that neither remember why and how it started. I only noticed it in my early 20s when I walked in on my mother taking a bite of a raw potato. That later ended up being served to my aunt as a side for her dinner. She did that to get back at my aunt for taking a bite on a specific apple that she had bought to make a pie. My mother's words to me were, "You saw nothing." Over the years, me and my uncle, my aunt's significant other, started discussing this petty and very funny war that has been going on, since we're both in a privileged position to share each side of the behind-the-scenes. Some of these stories were told to me by my uncle, because they happened before I was born more than 3 decades ago. Others I actually lived. Some I was forced to play a part in. Please enjoy this petty degeneracy. 1. When my aunt was an early teen, she would steal my mother's makeup because she didn't have her own. My mother was not happy because she saved to buy her own stuff. Grandmother found out and punished her by giving her a stack of sheets of paper and making her write something every day, a prose, a poem, a letter, etc. She would get her own makeup when the stack was finished, and she couldn't cheat because my grandmother knew how many sheets there were. My mother took this opportunity to buy the same kind of sheet of paper, and kept adding a sheet every day while my aunt was at school. This drove my aunt nuts months later, not seeing any progress with the stack not decreasing. Eventually my grandmother found out and put a stop to it. 2. Now, these ones are recent. Christmas is always celebrated, either in our house or my aunt's house. The guest cooks and the host cleans. Don't ask me why, it's been this way since I remember. A few years ago at our house, my aunt used every single thing in the kitchen, literally. It took us a couple of days to wash it all. Next year, my mother rearranged my aunt's entire kitchen. She changed the placement of every single thing. She swapped whole drawers. My uncle said it drove my aunt nuts not being able to find her stuff in her own kitchen, and it took them far too long to reorganize everything again. Then, the year after that, my aunt took the small parts of anything that was not a whole piece and hid them all over the kitchen. Quite genius. Everything seemed fine when they left, but you want coffee? There's filter holder. Want a microwave? The plate is there, but not the wheels underneath it so it does not turn. Want a smoothie? The lid on the machine that prevents everything from going everywhere is nowhere to be found. You get the picture. Everything was hidden either inside, pots we never use, mixed inside the flour bag, etc. Next Christmas, I noticed that my mother had a bag full of different food container lids in the trunk of her car when I was loading the presents in. But honestly, didn't think much of it. When we left, the bag was still there, full of lids. As it turns out, my mother has snuck the bag into my aunt's house and swapped all my aunt's container lids with those that she brought, essentially leaving my aunt with a bunch of containers and lids that didn't fit each other. Not a single one. I found out a few days later from a call from my uncle asking if we did something to the containers because he found my aunt on the kitchen floor surrounded by lids and containers bawling from frustration. 3. This one is a fail. One of the many, I add, but I think it's worth mentioning. My uncle confessed to me that sometimes he and my aunt get into arguments because she spends too much money on gifts to my mother. But not in a good way. Apparently, whenever she buys clothes to my mother, she will buy my mother's size and then the exact same clothing one size up. She is really good at sewing, so she swaps the tags in the hopes that my mom thinks that she's increasing in size. So she double spends just to be petty, and it fails because, since my aunt lives in another country, my mom just thinks that where she lives all clothes are sized differently. I've heard my mom say that on more than one occasion to her friends. It failed a few times already, but I gotta be honest. That had the potential to be a mastermind play right there. 2. My grocery has narrow one-way rows of angled parking, and the lot is very busy. In part because there's a shopping mall attached to its feeder road, and jerks will often speed through the lot from the feeder road to avoid a stoplight. Those entitled idiots frequently don't grasp the concept of one way. and cause traffic jams when they inevitably encounter drivers going the right way. It's dangerous, and many other cars and pedestrians don't expect morons barreling down the road the wrong way. When one of these traffic jams happens, the easiest way to fix it is the person who's going the right way has to pull back into a parking space, assuming there's an empty one, thus enabling the wrong way idiot to pass. Recently I was shopping with a friend, and as expected, we pulled out of our spot and naturally we soon met with a moron in a gigantic pickup truck bombing up the road the wrong way. Twice as big as my friend's car and radiating compensation. Well, it turns out she's had enough of these people. On this day, most parking spaces around us were filled, but there was one right there that she could have pulled into. Mr. Small Dick Energy in the pickup felt so entitled to right of way, he even stopped far enough back so she could pull into the spot for his convenience. Rather than do so, she surprised everyone by exaggeratedly slowing down and stopping a few feet from his huge bumper. Mr. Small Dick Energy then had the nerve to rev his engine a few times and keep creeping forward threateningly, as if he was going to force us back way up to the end of the aisle so he didn't have to do the same. My friend put her car in park and just waited. He then honked his horn at her as if she were the one going the wrong way. She pulled out her phone and started recording him. I was kind of scared he might road rage us to death, but he didn't. Behind us, the stoplight he should have gone through turned green, and I could see him seething as he watched all the normal drivers he thought he'd cut off getting their turn. In the end, infuriated, he threw his truck into reverse and slammed on the gas, backing up way too fast for a parking lot. About 4 parking spaces back, he miscalculated the angle of his wheel and wanged the back of his pickup on a cart corral. Not a disabling accident, and luckily he didn't hit a pedestrian, but I'm sure that'll cost him a pretty penny. He didn't even stop to get out and inspect the damage, most likely because he'd managed to publicly shame himself in such a grand fashion. It was so satisfying. 3. Way back in the late 80s, my husband and I drove from Omaha to Kansas City to see The Who at Arrowhead. I was about 8 months pregnant, and this was our last getaway before kid number 2 came around to keep us tethered for a while. When we got to our minivan, I know, after the show, there were about 6 to 8 college kids in the vacant spot next to ours. They were drinking beers and having a good time. They were also throwing their empty beer cans everywhere besides the trash can. Everywhere mostly seemed to be behind and on both sides of our car. This wasn't a big deal, but we had to back out and didn't want to have to run over about a dozen beer cans. As we were getting into the van, one of us said to them, "Hey, would you mind just moving the cans behind us so we can back out and go?" Out of nowhere, one of the guys in the group went to crazy town. His chest got all puffy, and he started yelling at us like, "Who do you think you are telling us me?" Now, years later, I don't remember what he said. I just remember we looked at each other with a WTAF is going on here expression. My husband said, "Look, we just want to leave, so move the beer cans from under and behind our car." Crazy Town moved into a whole other realm of ballistic. He started slamming his palm against the van window, hard, demanding that we make him move those cans. To this day, I am still amazed at the resilience of those Chrysler windows. #NotSpawn. His nuttiness provoked both of us, and we were both out of the van yelling at him to get away from our van. When it looked like a fight might break out between my husband and Crazy Town, I stepped in between. I didn't figure anyone was going to hit an 8-month pregnant woman. At this point, his buddies kind of pulled him back, but he was still mouthing off. We snaked our way forward between a couple of other cars and drove off with them throwing fists and yelling. A few rows over, we noticed a couple of police cars. We looked at each other and said, "Yep." We drove over and recounted what had happened. The officers saw my belly and told us to take him to them. So we drove back over. Crazy Town saw us and immediately jumped towards our van. clearly ready to resume his tirade. We pulled over into a parking spot, and that's when he saw the police car. The first thing the cop said was, "You boys having some fun here tonight?" We hear a round of, "Yes, sir," from the group. Then the cop asked, "Are you old enough to be drinking? Let's see some IDs." The group got quiet, real quiet. The cop says, "I didn't think so. So the first thing you're going to do is pour out every can that's here, open or unopened. And when that's done, we're going to talk about your disturbing the peace charges." We watched as the cop pulled a full case of beer from the trunk, and the kids started pouring out beer from the open case and the new case. Then we looked over at Crazy Town, waved out the window, and said with huge grins, "Have a good night. Bye." Still laughing, 36 years later. Still laughing. 4. I just remembered the Gesetz zur Modernisierung der gesetzlichen Krankenversicherung, also known as the Health Reform of 2004. Introduction. It was about making the system more efficient. Part of this was the introduction of patient co-payment, €10 per quarter for the practice, 10% co-payment for medicines and medical devices, at least 5 at a maximum of €10. The politicians had the idea that we go to the doctor for fun, woohoo, and thus place unnecessary strain on the system. A popular claim was that seniors constantly make doctor's appointments so they can read magazines in the waiting room. The co-payment for medicines and medical devices was mainly based on the idea that people would get medication prescribed by the doctor for fun and thus place unnecessary strain on the system. Medical devices would be crutches, wheelchairs, etc. Let's start. Practice fee. Everyone was against it when it was introduced. Doctors, patients, and health insurance companies were not happy either. If I recall correctly, the malicious compliance starts in the 2nd or 3rd year after the introduction. Slowly, 2 things happened at the same time. People said to themselves, "If I have to pay, then it should be worth it." On the one hand, that meant that if you had already paid for the quarter, you tried to squeeze in as many doctor's appointments as possible. On the other hand, towards the end of the quarter, hardly anyone went to the doctor who hadn't already paid. So, doctors' offices were totally overcrowded at the beginning of the quarter and very empty at the end. I don't know how many politician speeches I heard, radio and TV discussions, newspaper and magazine articles, saying that people should be reasonable. People should go to the doctor on the last day of the quarter and of course pay the full fee for the quarter, instead of going the next day and have a full quarter. Amazingly, the practice fee was already withdrawn at the beginning of 2013. It is therefore amazing that our politicians normally hardly withdraw any law. Unfortunately, the co-payment for medicines and medical devices remained. 5. I work at a casino as a dealer. We have a first-in, first-out way of scheduling dealers. So if you start at 7 p.m., you get to leave before people that started at 8 p.m., when they are able to close tables down and send you home. Pretty normal and straightforward. If more than one person starts at the same time, then who gets the option to leave first is assigned on a rotating basis. So if you have the first option one week, you will be second the following. Then third after that, then back to 1. So one afternoon, I was reporting to work with 2 other dealers, all set to arrive at the same time. I was looking forward to a short evening, as I was the first option and I had plans after work. I arrived 10 minutes before my shift, and noticed one of the dealers who was starting at my start time was already dealing. They, the dealer, must have been the EDR, and the pencil needed a dealer to start right away. I confirmed that they had started 15 minutes before their scheduled time, and they were the third option. Fast forward 6 hours, and we had tables we could start closing. I am stoked to get out of there, when I look over and see the dealer that started leaving before me. I pointed out that I was supposed to be leaving before her, and she gave me a crap-eating grin and said, "Well, I started before you, so I have the first option." And then she just walked off all smug. I was super mad and said something to the supervisor. He shrugged me off and said, It's policy. First to start leaves first. Okay, game on. I knew this coworker had kids, and had to wait for her mom to come over to babysit before she could leave for work, so she wasn't always early for her shift. I have no kids or obligations, so I started showing up 2 hours before my shift and just chilling in the EDR. I would let the supervisor know I was there in case they needed me to start early, which they always did, because they would not refuse to open a table for lack of staff knowing I was on property and available to work. 3 weeks of this, and I had held the first option on every shift I worked. The dealer, who was all smug about starting early, was getting frustrated and angry at me. Having to stay super late every night was wearing her down. "It would be nice to get off before close just once," she said to me as I was leaving early yet again. I told her I was just following policy, and she was welcome to show up early to make sure she was always first out. 2 more weeks and many complaints to the boss later, the policy was changed. Now, in order to jump option numbers, you have to be called in over an hour before your scheduled time. 15 minutes wasn't going to cut it anymore if you wanted to leave early. I hope that it was worth it for her staying until near close for over a month over that 15 minutes. I am petty, and I have a lot of free time. Now, before we go, let me answer some questions that I've been seeing to give some clarification. Yes, I showed up 2 hours early for my shift. However, I was paid for nearly all that extra time, as I always asked to start work early, since I was on property and available. I actually worked more hours and made more money during this time than I had previously. The difference in time leaving work was several hours. First option usually leaves around 9 p.m. to 10 p.m., while second and third options leave around 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., depending on business. My property is KYO, so the volume of hours is less important to us. Not really an excuse, but this coworker is not easy to get along with. She has had run-ins with just about every other dealer at some point. She is the type to quote directly when it works in her favor, and disparage the same policy the second it works against her. If she had something important to do the evening in question, or needed to leave because of childcare or whatever, I would have happily passed my option to her. My plans were not as important as something like childcare. It was the underhanded way she went about getting herself out early, combined with her snarky remark and that awful grin that made me want revenge. We do not use an EO list because it actually created similar issues. People would come by several hours before their shift to sign it, go home, then come back. People got upset. Management said you can't sign the EO more than 1 hour before your shift started, so nearly the entire crew would be an hour early and bicker over it. Then it was changed to, you can't sign the EO until you are clocked in at your scheduled time and enter the pit. This resulted in people showing up an hour early and camping out in line near the time clock like it was Black Friday. So yeah, no more EO list. I feel this is malicious compliance because she was very eager to point out to me that the option numbers shifting was policy, and the supervisor said she was correct. I was just following policy as she did, just to a more severe degree. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to Revenge's Ice Cream 399. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Before you go, please hit the like button and subscribe if you'd be so good, and do support me on my Patreon page, which is linked for you in the description. Even $1 a month is very helpful. Okay. I don't think we have any other business today, so let's move on to Hellfreezer's question of the day. And today's question is, things you do that you know are bad, but you do them anyway because it actually is more efficient even if it's bad. Like, for example, I know when I have a non-stick frying pan, I should not use metal utensils on it. But I do, because, quite frankly, they're sturdier, they're better, they're more reliable than the others. So it does mean that a frying pan doesn't really last me more than a year. Let me know what you think in a comment below. And before we go, let's take a look at the answer of the day from a previous video. And today's answer comes from Revenge's Ice Cream 291. And I believe this was about, do you prefer, when it comes to footwear, do you prefer like laces or slip-ons, that sort of thing? And today's answer comes from, let's see, Kerry Emberly Hamby. I recently got myself a pair of shoes that look like they have regular laces, but you don't tie them because there's nothing to tie. I love them. I've already decided next time I buy myself another pair of shoes, there'll be another pair of these. I put my shoes on in the time it takes to take 2 steps, and they never come off until I take them off intentionally, which is also easy. Everything about these shoes is easy, convenient, quick, and aesthetically pleasing. Hopefully they make them with white soles, so I can wear them in certain venues that are worried about marking up their floors. Thank you very much for your answer, Kerry. Okay, and with that, I'm going to head off for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourself.